About 10 years ago, I was at my local grocer's, wheeling my cart through the produce section as Al Green's "Let's Stay Together" oozed from the sound system. Suddenly a thought occurred. This is an old record. Shouldn't it feel weird to hear something that old in a grocery store instead of music from, I don't know, this century? Now, don't get me wrong. "Let's Stay Together" is great pop music. Not only did Green's version top both the pop and R&B charts in 1971, but 12 years later the song was back in the top 40 thanks to a remake by Tina Turner. But it was almost 40 years old when it serenaded me in the supermarket, and as I stood there, paused between the navel oranges and the bell peppers, I asked myself, what would it have felt like being grocery shopping in 1971 and hearing music that was 40 years old? Well, being old enough to have actually been in grocery stores in 1971, I knew that pop records would not have been on the playlist. Back then, shoppers prowled the aisles to recordings made by the Muzak Corporation, which at the time specialized in pleasant but denatured instrumental versions of pop hits. It was music that sounded vaguely contemporary but was hardly the hits of the day. "Let's Stay Together" wasn't a hit of the day when I heard it in the produce section either, so why didn't it sound old? Was there some sort of Dorian Gray effect going on here? To get a sense of what kind of time warp I was at work with, when I got home I dug out my copy of Joel Whitburn's Pop Memories and looked up the #1 recordings of 1931. There were 16 singles on the list that year, 2 fewer than topped the charts in 1971. Cab Calloway's "Minnie the Moocher," which spent a single week in the top slot, was probably the only one a listener today would know.
Hey folks, here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down hoochie-coocher.
Of the other 9, most were songs I knew, but in performances I didn't. Among those was "Dream a Little Dream of Me," performed by Wayne King and his orchestra. That tune would have been familiar enough in 1971, as it had been a top 20 hit for Mama Cass Elliot 3 years earlier. But I'd never heard King's version or even come across his name. So what did King's Dream sound like? I had to sum it up in a single word. That word would be old. Not just out of fashion, but genuinely antique. It's not something I could ever imagine buying bell peppers to. Not in 1971, and certainly not in this century. But what, in the age of recorded music, does it really mean to sound old? To answer that, let's consider a parallel example. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was composed between 1804 and 1808, making it roughly 122 years older than "Dream a Little Dream of Me." Simply going by the calendar, that would make it old as dirt. But did what we hear sound old? Think about that while we listen to another recording of the Fifth. Now that was genuinely ancient. Although both recordings were performed by the Berlin Philharmonic, the first one, conducted by Sir Simon Rattle, was made in 2016, whereas the second, directed by Arthur Nikisch, was made 103 years earlier in 1913. While Beethoven scholars could point to aspects of tempo and phrasing indicating that Maestro Nikisch hewed to an earlier interpreter style than Sir Simon, the obvious tell for the rest of us is the sound quality. The 2016 recording sounds like the orchestra would sound if you were sitting in a seat at the Berlin Philharmonic listening to the orchestra live. By contrast, the 1913 performance sounds flat, tinny, with a constant hiss of surface noise that even digital filtering couldn't scrub away. Whereas the first version is like a sharp digital portrait, the second is like a pencil sketch. And that's the first factor in the Dorian Gray effect: sound quality. After high-quality stereo recording became the norm in the 1960s, it was practically impossible to date an album or single simply by the quality of the sound. But what of the music itself? Sticking with Beethoven for a moment, shouldn't a symphony that's hundreds of years old be considered well past its best before date? In this case, no. Beethoven's Fifth is a bit of an exceptionality. Its first four notes constitute what is perhaps the most recognizable motif in music, as familiar a cultural icon as the Mona Lisa or Mickey Mouse. Not all Beethoven symphonies meet that mark. The Ode to Joy from Symphony No. 9 probably does, thanks in part to the EU having made it the basis for its Anthem of Europe. But Symphony No. 8? Beethoven's Second? Sorry. There's other music that's so familiar we don't think about how old it is. Happy Birthday to You first appeared in print in 1912, while its melody, which originally sported the lyrics Good Morning to You, predates that by 2 decades. But when it's sung, the only age anyone thinks about is that of the person whose birthday it is. It can work that way for recordings as well. A few years back, a combo I play in was hired to provide background music for an alumni event at Ryerson University. Nothing fancy, just quiet, mainstream jazz to talk over. During our break, however, a hip-hop dance crew made up of university students performed. Most of what they danced to was contemporary hip-hop, Drake, Common, and the like. But what surprised me was the music they chose for their finale.
Celebrate good times, come on! Let's celebrate. Celebrate good times, come on! Let's celebrate.
Celebration by Kool and the Gang was released in the fall of 1980 and topped the Billboard Hot 100 in February 1981. In other words, not only was it older than all of the dancers, it was probably as old as many of their parents. But like Happy Birthday to You, Celebration is exempt from aging. It's what people play when there's something to celebrate, period. Celebration also illustrates another aspect of the Dorian Gray effect. There's nothing about it in terms of musical style, instrumentation, or delivery that sounds old-fashioned. Although many of the rhythmic devices, the muscular backbeat, the choked single-note rhythm guitar, the Rhodes piano, hark back to 70s funk and disco, they haven't fallen out of use or relevance. Just ask Mark Ronson. To understand what would make a recording sound like an antique, let's go back to Wayne King and Dream a Little Dream of Me. We've already touched on its primitive mono sound, but it's the rhythm that gives the game away. King's men make the melody seem rigidly straight. Rather than swing the eighth notes so a triplet feel is implied, da 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 da, what they play sounds as if the melody were made of dotted eighths and sixteenths. There was another recording of Dream a Little Dream of Me released in 1931, this one by Ozzie Nelson, later of Ozzie and Harriet fame. But his sound's very different.
Stars shining bright above you, night breezes seem to whisper I love you, birds singing in the sycamore tree, dream a little dream of me.
Placed side by side, the two versions mark a generational shift. King, known as the Waltz King for his way with three-quarter time, represented the dying embers of a European-derived dance band style that fell out of favor as swing bands came to dominate the radio waves of the 1930s. Nelson, though hardly a modernist, played with two prevailing trends, leaning cautiously toward jazz phrasing while following the crooning vocal fashion established by Bing Crosby, who had 3 #1 singles in 1931. That's why, even though both recordings seem dated to our ears, Nelson's version is less painfully passé. By 1971, King's clunky foxtrot was 5 generations behind current tastes, and would have sounded it. In the 1970s, even 50s rock and roll seemed retrograde, and had been exiled from pop radio to the dreary netherworld of the oldies stations. This was because, for the first 6 decades of the 20th century, pop styles were like fashion trends. Not only did they have a short shelf life, but they were largely abandoned once they fell out of favor. And so Cakewalk gets swept out the door by Ragtime, which in turn is made a wallflower by Stride, and Stride is eventually crowded off the dance floor by Swing. Moreover, each new fad had its own dances and brand new rhythmic feel, one that made its predecessor seem anemic in comparison. Everything changed with the arrival of the backbeat, which shifted the rhythmic emphasis from the first and third beats, which you see here, to the second and fourth. The backbeat was implied in Boogie Woogie, stated in Jump Blues, and shouted by rock and roll.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music. Any old way you choose it. It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it.
And like Chuck Berry said, you can't lose it. Backbeat has been central to the DNA of pretty much every pop trend of the last 60 years, and is probably the single biggest factor in the Dorian Gray effect because it carries through from trend to trend. A house beat may be more intense than a disco beat, but both are built on the same backbeat structure. Another change that was in the air in 1971 was the rise of FM radio, which expanded the notion of genre to create what Eric Weisbard described as, quote, the rival mainstreams of American music, close quote. Instead of muscling their predecessors aside, now new pop styles blazed their own path, leaving their forebears to continue on relatively unscathed. Consequently, punk rock, new wave, and alternative didn't destroy mainstream rock, but instead were accorded their own realm of modern rock. Meanwhile, the elders of album-oriented rock slid into the more catalog-friendly format of classic rock, an aesthetic that, like the Dorian Gray effect, blurred the distinction between new and older sounds. So why doesn't every old record benefit from the Dorian Gray effect? Let's look at some disqualifying features. For starters, nothing says time capsule more clearly than a hook that's hung on a long-forgotten pop culture fad. Ray Stevens' The Streak, C.W. McCall's Convoy, Redneck's Cotton Eye Joe, Los Del Rios' La Macarena, or Silento's Watch Me, none of them will pass the test of timelessness. You can also hear it in the way the instruments are played. Guitars, which became the dominant pop instrument of the 1960s, continues to be a part of the pop soundscape, but here too, some sounds have become passé. While the reverb-laden twang popularized by Dick Dale, the Ventures, or the Safaris continues to be used by musicians today, it's now something of a special effect, a sound intended to induce nostalgia. When the Lindrum was introduced in 1982, its high-quality, digitally sampled drum sounds were thought to be the nail in the coffin compared to synthesized rhythm composers like the Roland TR-808. But the 808's deep bass drum and tinny cowbell tones are beloved by dance music producers and remain in use today, whereas no electronic percussion effects sound so quintessentially 80s and utterly dated as the Lindrum handclap. Which brings me to my final story. A couple days ago I went to the local musical instrument store to buy a pop screen for my microphone. While I was there, there's a young man in his 20s who came in to buy some DJ equipment. And what did he use to test out the new gear? A 40-year-old single that still gets him on the dance floor.
You know, I was wondering, if you could keep on, because the force, it's got a lot of power, and it makes me feel like